it can be said that humanity has been around for something in the region of 2 million years. Now, an argument can be made about that, but what we think of as recognisably human goes back rather far, and modern humans are in the region of 200 to 160,000 years. So although our history is long, our lives are actually relatively short, being in the region of 80 years, and that creates a problem for us. And the problem is, all those people who went before, do they matter? Do they have an impact today? And will I matter when I'm gone as well? To get some insight into that, we can look at our prehistory, the history before records began, and look at how our ancestors dealt with the difference between the living and the dead, and how that impacts our view of it today. To do that, we can look at a prehistoric village in Orkney called Skara Brae, discovered in the 1850s, that was occupied something like 5,000 years ago. 99% of human history occurred before the Stone Age. The Stone Age is divided into 3 parts, and the big change that happened was what's called the Neolithic, when people settled down to be farmers, and that changed the whole relationship that people had. They had stable dwellings, more property, more things, because they didn't have to drag it around with them, and of course it changed the relationship between the living and the dead. So places like this, which is the Unstone Cairn, we think of as very little more than mounds of earth stone. But of course, inside there are chambers, and in those chambers we find the dead. That's very strange to us, because we think of them as just tombs. But when we consider how they were made, then they seem to represent much more. They're built just as a living house would be built, and then covered with earth, transmuting a house of the living into a house for the dead. So the similarities are actually really surprising. They're built to the same pattern, they have the same niches to rest in. It's just that the rest in one of them is very much longer. Of course, this was a time when people were becoming more settled in the landscape and society was changing. They were forming larger, more complex communities. The attitude towards the dead also changed. The recent dead with their decomposing bodies are feared, but the long dead, reduced to bare bones, are revered. In this concept, the living and the dead were really bound together, and the living couldn't survive without the assistance of the dead. When we think about the Neolithic way of life, of course the group was all important. The tight bonds of clan and family held everything together, and unsurprisingly, although some ancestors would have been individually worshipped, they were worshipped mostly as a group. It mattered that they were a group and part of the community because they were a link between the land of the living and the spirits that were all around them. Neolithic man was essentially an animist and believed that everything had a spirit associated with it, and the group that was the ancestor could form a mediator between the living and the spirits around, and that's why everything was so tied together. But of course, things continued to change. Humanity grew in number, and those tight bonds of family began to slacken as the places that they lived grew bigger and bigger. And of course, that again changed our relationship to the dead. It shifted from the idea of a group to the idea of an individual, and the way we constructed the House of the Dead also changed and became monuments, if you like, to the individual person. Of course, none of us likes to think about our own mortality, but every now and then something forces you into considering it, and when you do, you like to think somehow you'll escape, maybe you'll live longer, maybe the singularity will come and save you. The truth is, of course, at this point in time, at some time or other, we're going to be forced to think about it. If you do think about it, one thing you realise pretty quickly is this idea of the individual is, in our history, pretty new. The Neolithic had it more right than we like to think, because we always stand on the shoulders of those who went before us. Their memories, their experiences, what they were, live inside our landscape and ourselves. In fact, they never really leave you. And that's the whole point. I think it's what the Neolithic really were able to grasp, and we in our recent history have lost to a degree. I mean, we still have it. We just don't give it the kind of credence in our everyday thoughts when we think about these things. But it's still there. Those people who went before you are present in your landscape of your life right now as you walk through it, and they never leave you. And equally, you'll never leave those that you think you're leaving behind.